Mr. President, there have been many words that have been spoken about our friend, Senator John McCain, and I want to join with the many words, the tributes that have been shared in these recent days since his passing. We all know the background, we all know the bio. John McCain served our nation for 60 years, starting as an officer in the United States Navy, as a prisoner of war in unspeakable conditions, and then, of course, during his terms in the House of Representatives and here in the Senate for some 30 years. That's the biography of the man, but it really is just the start of who he was and the mark that he made not only on the lives of us here in the Senate, but really on the lives of Americans all over the country. John McCain was a beloved colleague. He was a patriot. He was truly an American hero. He had remarkable intellect. He had an iron will, most certainly, unquestionable integrity, courage that was absolutely unwavering. When I think about John and how John approached issues, John was one who did what he thought was right. And when he thought he was right, there wasn't much arguing with him. He was right. But even then, we would engage. We would go back and forth. And I think that oftentimes it was those arguments that caused us to certainly either gain greater respect or perhaps greater fear, depending on where you were in the process. But John was one of those guys who favored straight talk. And so I don't think he would have any hard feelings about any of us describing our relationship with him over the years. We didn't always agree, and sometimes we maybe didn't even get along, but the truth of the matter was John McCain would always make sure that you knew where he stood. And John was very clear that you had to earn his respect. Respect was not just something that came with a title. Because you were a United States Senator didn't mean that you had earned his respect. And I know because I felt that in my early years here in the Senate. I came through an appointment, and I think John McCain was just going to wait to see if I was able to prove myself. And he ultimately decided, apparently, that I had. Came up to me one day, and we were actually walking down the aisle there, and he comes up and he says, "You know, you're okay, kid." After that was high praise. Now, we all have heard some of the legendary stories of when individuals kind of came head-to-head or toe-to-toe with John McCain. Certainly there were some areas where we disagreed. We had a little bit different view on earmarks, and that was not just my relationship with Senator McCain, but previous Alaska senators as well. But I think we all agreed that our disagreements were principled in nature. I remember one very interesting and heated exchange over the merits of essential air service. And John was on one side of the issue, and I was an advocate for essential air. And I said, we're literally nose to nose. And I said, don't you understand that when it's called essential air, it's because it's essential, because we don't have roads to these places. And he kind of growled at me, and, well, I don't know why we need to have it. Legendary back and forths. And sometimes you won, sometimes John won, but it was always with a great deal of passion that these exchanges moved forward. And then there was the other end of the spectrum, those times when John and I were voting together, sometimes against the majority of our own party. Healthcare and the ACA vote last year is certainly a prime example of that. That was a tough vote. That was a tough vote for our conference. It was a difficult vote, but I will tell you it was comforting to have some solidarity with my friend John McCain, even when it was clear that we may have disagreed with many of our colleagues. But John was one that when he had made his mind up, he had made his mind up, and you respected that. John had visited Alaska, and it helped validate his view that climate change is real. It's something that we have to deal with, that we have to take practical steps to address it. And I agree with John. I don't need any convincing on that, and I'm going to be proud to help achieve that goal. I valued John's work on campaign finance reform and comprehensive immigration reform. Now, I was never part of the gang on immigration, but my votes clearly marked me as a fellow traveler. We also had a strong respect for our native peoples. Both Arizona and Alaska have many tribes and large concentrations of Indigenous Americans, and his decades of work to advance the cause of Native people were really legendary. And because John accomplished so much during his time here, we all talk about his time spent on the international front, working on defense issues, but I think oftentimes the issue area with Native Americans and in Indian issues was overlooked. So let me just comment on that for a moment. Back in the 1990s, John joined with Senator Inouye of Hawaii on amendments to the Indian Self-Determination Act, providing for tribal self-governance compacting. And this opened up a whole new era of opportunity for Alaska tribes. It laid the groundwork for Alaska tribes to take over the delivery of Native health care from a failing federal bureaucracy. And now, around the state, whether you're up in Utqiagvik or down in Ketchikan, they enjoy award-winning, world-class health care in a system that the Native people control. And that really would not have been possible without people like John McCain fighting for our Native people. I think that John would have been proud of me on the afternoon that he passed. I was in the village of Savunga, which is a small community, about 800 people on St. Lawrence Island, about 40 miles from Russia. It's in the Bering Sea, one of the most remote places in Alaska. And I was there to conduct a field hearing of the Indian Affairs Committee, focused on poor housing conditions, overcrowding housing, where our Native people are forced to live in extraordinarily difficult homes with difficult sanitation problems in these very remote communities. John was really a champion for ending the third world living conditions that too many of our Native people still endure. And we got a lot of work, a lot of unfinished work on that front, and I plan to attack it with the same vigor that John brought to the fight. I mentioned John's love for our military, for our veterans. He will long be remembered for his efforts to bring our military back from years of neglect and devastating pain of sequestration. The story that we all know, John working on major defense budgets and being an extraordinary advocate for all of our defense. My story and how it intersects with a very, very small group of elderly Alaska warriors, I think demonstrates that this big, strong, gruff guy who was truly taking on the world had a very soft spot in his heart, and the kindness that he showed to these few elderly Alaska Native Guard veterans is something that is worthy of sharing. After Senator Stevens left the Senate in 2009, the Pentagon had tried to cut off the pensions of 24, just 24 elderly men who served in the Alaska Territorial Guard during World War II. And Stevens had worked really, really hard to get their service counted as military service and to grant them veteran status. And not unlike the way Ted did things, he took care of it in the appropriations process. So it was an earmark. And over the Christmas holiday, the Pentagon kind of worked to reinterpret that earmark. And needless to say, Ted is gone. This is an important issue, again, to these 24 elderly veterans. And so I moved an amendment on the Defense Appropriations Bill to reverse it. And I talked to John, and he was pretty skeptical at first because he says it's an earmark. But then he asked whether or not these Native Guardsmen, these Eskimo scouts, had actually seen war. And I was able to share with him the story of those who had stood lookout on the homeland in the Aleutian Islands. The reminder that in Alaska we were the only American soil that was occupied by the Japanese in World War II, and that it was these Native warriors who were standing guard, standing lookout. So, long story short, John knew that supporting these elderly veterans was the right thing to do. So many things that we can share about John, but really when I think about his legacy going forward, whether he's Project Maverick, as my friend from South Carolina has said, or however we choose to remember him, I do hope that history will remember John as an institutionalist in the highest tradition of the Senate. He was committed to thoughtful debate and regular order. He was effective committee chairman, respecting the interests of members on both sides. He managed his bills on the floors, working hand in hand with the other side, and these were tough bills. The annual defense authorization bill draws something on the order of 600 amendments. He was always protective of committee prerogatives. He was known to put his foot down when appropriators sought to muscle out the authorizers, and he was always looking towards compromise and bipartisanship. And he fought for our institution because he never lost sight of the fact that the legislative branch is a co-equal branch of government, not subordinate to the White House. And he took no guff, we all know, from the administration, no matter who was in charge. And that wasn't just because John liked to flex his senatorial muscle. It was because he was a true believer in the Constitution and in its checks and balances. He was a true believer in the institutions of government and a true believer in democracy. John certainly made his share of history. He's earned his place in it, and I think we all know how much we will miss him, his passion, his courage. His loss leaves us sad, but at the same time, I think that it offers us a beacon of hope here in the Senate as we reflect on his life and his contributions. And Senator Graham has observed that John will not be replaced by any one senator. It's going to take all of us working together. It's going to take all of us to really accomplish what John knew we were capable of. And by coming together, respecting one another, one another's principles, even when we disagree, and working through these disagreements to compromise, that's how we really honor John's legacy. There's a lot of words, and these words will come and go, but the way to truly honor him is to live out what he believed this Senate is capable of doing. We were reminded that there's a little John McCain in all of us, I think it would be good for us to remind one another of that, to urge the inner John McCain in each of us to present itself in a way that betters our institution. So, on behalf of the people of the 49th state, the great state of Alaska, I thank you, John McCain. I thank the family for the years that you gave him to us, to his country. We will take it from here, inspired by your service, John McCain, by your intellect, by your integrity, and by your determination to do right. May you rest in peace, John McCain. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.